Great to be here. I appreciate the invitation and the chance to speak on literature and faith I was asked to speak on. But what I'm going to speak on is that subject, but more broadly thought of, the life of culture in the Christian. And I want to begin by referring you to a movie that many of you have no doubt seen. It came several years ago. It's called March of the Penguins. And it pulled in blockbuster numbers at the box office, despite the fact that it was a story of speechless creatures who spend their time trekking across the ice of Antarctica and huddling together to brave 100-mile-an-hour winds and temperatures as cold as 80 below. In the movie, director Luc Jacquet skillfully shifts our attention from scene to scene every 15 seconds or so, and Morgan Freeman's majestic, understated narration carries the story along so naturally that it seems to pass in the twinkling of an eye. But long after we've turned off the DVD and gone on to other things, those penguins are staying put for hours, for weeks, for months. If you and I were living in penguin time, for example, lunch today would be our last meal. I think I got the math right here, until commencement weekend. And as things run by the penguin clock, if you happen to be one of the males who stay behind to protect the eggs while the females trundle off on a 70-mile march to the ocean, you'll be standing in a cluster of about 1,000 penguins with your back to the wind from now until Easter. Between now and then, there's no food, no drink, except perhaps for some ice you manage to melt in your gullet. Aside from that, there's nothing to do but to wait in the wind with new life nestled between your feet. But in the penguin world, there's something else that's missing. And it has to do with what you and I and all the rest of us do around this place. Some naturalists might quibble with this assertion, but I'll put the point simply. Those penguins don't have any culture. They don't strategize to plan chapels on faith and learning. They don't while away their hours translating Akkadian cuneiform texts. In the endless dark of the Antarctic winter, the penguins aren't reading the flippered equivalent of Emily Dickinson. They're not straining to understand quantum physics or string theory. They're not filling out bracket sheets for the Division I polar playoffs, nor are they streaming from Netflix Sleepless in Sub-Zero on their penguin iPads. No, all they do is eat and mate and wait. In the meantime, while they've been standing silently in the Antarctic cold, we'll all be poring through books, playing guitars, uploading photos, talking over lunch or into the night about the problem of evil, the hermeneutics of suspicion, the nature and necessity of interfaith dialogue. I went to seminary at Gordon Conwell back in the day, and I've always said that the 2 years I spent there, earning my MA in theological studies, were the two most important years of my intellectual and spiritual formation. I had a terrific time at Gordon Conwell, but I also know how stressful and spiritually disruptive the graduate study of biblical criticism and history can be. Back then, and over the years, I've awakened more than once in the night and felt the pull of what I call 3 a.m. thoughts. Yeah, what if Nietzsche had it right, entirely right? Who is, or was there ever, a historical Jesus? What if Christ was not raised from the dead? What if you and I are indeed, of all men and women, most to be pitied? So there may be times, even or during our studies in Christian thought and practice, when the thoughtless life of a penguin doesn't look that bad. In certain moods, it may look downright appealing. That's how it was for me when I was 11 or 12 years old. I had a dog, a mongrel named Tootsie, and I really envied Tootsie. As wounding words flew between my parents on long and dark winter nights, I'd sometimes look over at Tootsie, and I'd marvel that she neither understood the desperate bitterness of what she heard, nor did she know that one day she would die. She was like the birds of which the poet W.H. Auden once wrote in a poem. Not one of them was capable of lying. There was not one which knew that it was dying. If to be human is to know that we may be betrayed and to be certain that we will die, are the delights of culture and the fruits of learning worth the emotional price we pay for them? Emily Dickinson openly wondered about this in another poem having to do with birds. Of course I prayed. And did God care? He cared as much as on the air a bird had stamped her foot and cried, "Give me my reason, life I had not had but for yourself. 'Twere better charity to leave me in the atom's tomb, merry and naught, and gay and numb, than this smart misery." The study of history, literature, philosophy, and theology will tell us that in the second half of the 19th century, men and women in the West began to worry in new ways, in serious ways, about the place of human beings in the larger scheme of things. Plato may have taken the soul to be a repository of our memories of the eternal world, and St. Augustine may have detected in the soul's striving hints of the hunger that drives us to God. But for Dickinson and some others in her day, it seemed the human mind and the human heart might only be curious accidents in a mindless scheme of things. If that is how things are, then it might have been more charitable, Dickinson suggests, for the powers that be to have left the poet in the atom's tomb, where she would have been merry because she would have been naught, and where she would have been gay and carefree because she was numb. That might have been preferable to what she calls this smart misery. And that word smart carries a double sense of intelligence and pain, like a sharp paper cut. The smart misery of knowledge can really sting. Or even more pointedly, let's hear what Frederick Douglass had to say about the mixed blessings of reading and cultural understanding. As a young slave, Frederick lived for several years in Baltimore. During that time, his master's wife began to teach him to read until her husband angrily brought the training to an end. He told his wife that reading would only make young Frederick a dangerous and discontented slave. Refusing to be stymied, Douglass began to read. But looking back, he realized that at first, the more he read, the more, quote, that very discontentment which Master Hugh had predicted came to torment and sting my soul to unutterable anguish. The blessing of knowledge, of learning, became a curse. This is Douglass. Reading had given me a view of my horrid condition without the remedy. It opened my eyes to the horrible pit, but to no ladder upon which to get out. In moments of agony, I my fellow slaves for their stupidity. I have often wished myself a beast, a dog, a penguin, I might add. I preferred the condition of the meanest reptile to my own. Anything, no matter what, to get rid of thinking. It was this everlasting thinking of my condition that tormented me. There was no getting rid of it. The longer Douglass thought about slavery, the clearer it became to him that to make, quote, a contented slave, it is necessary to make a thoughtless one. As long as the slave stayed within what he calls the circle and knew nothing of an outside world that could be imagined and desired or even achieved, that slave could live with a measure of contentment. But once Douglass had envisioned the possibility of freedom, thinking about his bondage became unbearable. So unbearable that he began to think the unthinkable. I often found myself regretting my own existence, he writes, and wishing myself dead. And but for the hope of being free, I have no doubt but that I should have killed myself. Douglass eventually escaped to freedom and led in the abolitionist fight. But the fact remains that spiritual despair and psychic pain of the kind he and Dickinson experienced are things that only human beings can know and endure. Knowing nothing of such things, the penguins of Antarctica and dogs like Tootsie have a contentment of sorts that our restless hearts can only envy. That being the case, is the smart misery that comes with the acquisition of knowledge in the life of culture worth the price we pay? I answer that question with a resounding yes. And my yes is grounded in a deep, sustaining faith in the crucified and risen Christ. As an aside, I'll say I've just, in my most recent book, begun to write about some of these things. This is very much my story. Those kinds of pains in my teenage years, those were the pains that set me on the path that led me to faith in the risen Christ. So when I speak of my love of learning and my love of culture, it is a love of learning and a love of culture that I have acquired and found deepened and strengthened through my knowledge of the cross and the empty tomb. In a novel that John Updike, Crucifixion and the Resurrection of Christ, is what he calls the dark, tangled, visceral aspects of Christianity. The going through quality of it. The passage unto death and into death and suffering that redeems and inverts these things like an umbrella blowing inside out. But however specifically Christian my convictions about the value of knowledge and culture may be, I also share my belief in the worth of learning with people of other faiths. And here I think of how, along with them, I affirm the goodness of bodily life and cultural life as we know them, as we enjoy the blessings they bring and the blessings they bring, and as we enjoy the blessings they bring, and as we suffer the sorrows that often go hand in hand with them. And I couldn't help but think as we were praying, I was alone and I didn't pray because I didn't want to make sure I wasn't on mic. I prayed silently. But as I heard the hum of your voices praying, I thought of the opening of that great 1987 film by Wim Wenders called Wings of Desire. It's a wonderful film. I think it's a great Christian work of art. And it's about two angels, especially one of the two, an angel who longs to know the joys and bittersweet limits of mortal life. And it opens with him hovering over Berlin, and all you hear are the murmurs of voices with all their cares and anxieties, loves and longings and concerns. And that angel so much wants to know the life that leads to that murmur of voices. The opposite of what I have in mind here, this affirmation of life, is something we could describe as the pursuit of nothingness. We call it nihilism. And this pursuit fits in with a clear psychological profile in the modern era. Here's what I mean. Think of the prototype for what I'm talking about. Satan, as John Milton imagines him in Paradise Lost. This is Satan as he looks at Adam and Eve in the garden in book 4 of that work. The more I see pleasures about me, so much more I feel torment within me, Satan confesses. And because of the intensity of his inner pain, he vows to destroy God's handiwork. For only in destroying I find ease to my relentless thoughts. One of the followers of the nihilist tradition is the character of Lisa in Fyodor Dostoevsky's incomparable novel, The Brothers Karamazov. When she tells Alyosha, the man who loves her, that she, quote, wants terribly to set fire to her own house, he asks her, why do evil? And Lisa replies, so that there will be nothing left anywhere. Ah, how good it would be if there were nothing left. How do we respond to such a love of pain, such a longing for nothingness and destruction? We could argue with such characters in fiction and people in our lives and hope that our reasoning might convict them about the beauty of the world and life as God has given them to us. But instead of arguing, I might urge them and encourage us to recognize that the true end of all our knowing, the goal of our life and culture, does involve thinking and knowing things that penguins and puppies could never imagine. Such knowledge, for example, entails learning the art of giving blessings and granting forgiveness. Near the end of Shakespeare's King Lear, there is a scene whose tender beauty breaks my heart each time I teach the play. The aged king and his daughter Cordelia have been reunited after a period of deep estrangement, and now they're being led off to prison. Cordelia begins to protest, but Lear begs her to accept their plight. No, 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 no. Come, let's away to prison. We two, alone, will sing like birds in the cage. When thou dost ask me blessing, I'll kneel down and ask of thee forgiveness. In longing for an everlasting cycle of blessing and forgiveness, Lear shows how much he, the once stubborn king, has learned as a suffering subject. Lear's gone to the school of sorrow, and he's learned what William Butler Yeats was to describe centuries later as the goal of all education and culture. In courtesy, I'd have her chiefly learn it, he wrote of his daughter. Hearts are not had as a gift, but hearts are earned by those that are not entirely beautiful. And all of us who are called by our God to earn such hearts are in the end simply children who play and suffer, suffer and play. A touchstone moment for me at Gordon Conwell came in my first semester. I had a course with the marvelous title, Christianity and Celebration, and it was taught by a great man who came over in the merger from Conwell Seminary and only stayed 2 years at Gordon Conwell. His name is Stuart Barton Babbage. He's a really major figure in Australian church history and was a wonderful teacher. He invited his New Testament colleague Ramsey Michaels to come in one night and give a talk. Michaels based his lecture on 1 John 2, 28 to 3:3. He asked us to consider the fact that John calls the followers of Christ little children. And then he said, if that is what and who we truly are, then we are free. Indeed, we're called to do what children do, which is play. And play is what we undertake in the life of culture, and in many ways, at the heart of our learning. We imagine worlds. We take delights in sounds and rhythms. We cherish the surprise of metaphors. We can't get enough of stories. There's that great moment at the end of that wonderful film, Princess Bride, and when the Fred Savage character asks his grandfather to read it again, to read it again. We try on different ideas and identities, and we dream of ways that diseases might be cured, wounds healed, and enemies reconciled. And we do so with the hope that when Christ is fully revealed, we will be like him, for we will see him as he is. In a discussion of the role of the arts in Christian life, Karl Barth takes care to remind us that we, quote, must not try to view our work on earth as a solemnly serious cooperation with God. Instead, he said, our ideal as Christians should be to see the arts, learning, and cultural life, see them seriously. Don't get Barth wrong here. If anybody knew the power of evil and injustice, and anyone knew the sting of death and thought about these things, it was Karl Barth. But he said, in the end, we should think of what we do when we learn and act in culture and society as ways of playing in the peace of our Father's house. Or in the words of Ralph Waldo Emerson, written about a century earlier, the nonchalance of boys who are sure of a dinner is the healthy attitude of human nature. All this talk about fathers who bless, daughters who forgive, and sons who play brings me back to Auden. In a poem written shortly before he returned to the Christian faith, he seemed to be speaking to himself
when he affirmed that blessing and forgiving were indeed at the heart of life. Life remains a blessing, although you cannot bless. You shall love your crooked neighbor with your crooked heart. More than a decade later, Auden wrote again a blessing, this time in a poem addressed to his senses. Like the penguins, those senses of touch and taste and sight have neither the capacity to complain about their lot nor any reason to do so. But I, the poet says of himself, I could face the sky and roar in anger and despair at what is going on. In response to my cries, Auden says, the sky would only wait and then finally reiterate, as if I wasn't there, that singular command I do not understand. Bless what there is for being, which has to be obeyed. For what else am I made for? Agreeing or disagreeing? For each of you, as you leave this place in the coming months and years to launch your own long march through the life of culture and church and family and service, my hope is that you will be able to treasure the arts and the hearts you have learned and earned here, and that you will be eager, with all your knowledge, with all your mind and your heart and your soul, to bless what there is for being. For what else have you and I been made for? Agreeing or disagreeing?